We're expecting the first official findings into last month's deadly Air India crash.
The preliminary investigation report on the crash is expected to be released in 2 days from now.
The report suggests that these switches are emerging as a possible reason for the sudden loss of engine thrust. Shifting a switch from run to cut off immediately cuts off fuel to the engine, causing a shutdown. This image from the air current shows the position of the switches and how they are shielded from accidental movement.
Well, we're here today to do an update on the Air India 171 crash. And this is not the video that we wanted to make. In fact, the information that we're now gleaning from the preliminary report that's been handed over from AAIB to the Indian government is nothing short of stunning. And I don't use that word loosely. It is a stunning conclusion, and it surrounds the fuel control switches. More on that in a minute. But there are major news agencies now around the planet that are reporting on the findings of that preliminary report, to include Air Current, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal has a quote, and let me get started out with this. It says, according to them, and I quote, "Preliminary findings indicate the switches controlling fuel flow to the jet's two engines were turned off, leading to an apparent loss of thrust shortly after takeoff." So in this video, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about what happened, how it happened, and then we're going to delve into a little bit of why. We're not going to get too far into that, but we're going to try to do a little bit of that. So let's review a little bit. We know what happened. What happened was this. There was a dual engine failure shortly after liftoff with Air India 171. We know that because the Ram Air Turbine, or the RAT, deployed shortly after takeoff. And in fact, that RAT deployed almost immediately after takeoff, which is something that has been bothering me about this whole situation for a while, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the only reason that that RAT would deploy would be one of three reasons on the 787: a total electrical failure, a total hydraulic failure, or a dual engine failure. The dual engine failure is the most likely, and now it's confirmed by the Wall Street Journal that it was a dual engine failure. And we have evidence of that because the aircraft had enough lift to get airborne. It only stayed airborne for less than 60 seconds. Some place about 8 to 10 seconds after liftoff, it's apparent that the airplane began to lose lift over the wings. That was due to the fact that both engines now were no longer operating. I'll explain what I mean by that specifically here in a minute also. And then the airplane started to lose lift. The nose came over and the airplane just simply wallowed into the buildings off of the end of the runway. So dual engine failure, how could that happen? That's the what of all of this. And in previous videos, we talked about some of the theories that could have led to that. And they fall into two basic camps. One is there was something wrong with the fuel itself, and the other is somehow fuel was cut off to the engines. And I explained that on every flight I fly, I actually manually cut off the fuel to the engines at the end of the flight. So when we taxi into our gate and I set the parking brake, I look over to my first officer and I say, place both fuel control switches to cut off. At that point, the co-pilot does that, places them both to cut off. The engine's now shut off, and I finish the rest of my secure checklist, and I go back and I greet the passengers at the door. That's something that happens on every flight. That's not something that happens while the airplane is airborne. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal and these other Air Current and Reuters and the others, they're saying that fuel was cut off manually at the fuel control switches. Both fuel control switches were in the cutoff position shortly after takeoff. So let's answer some objections to that. Is it possible that there's a procedure where that could take place? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. There are procedures where the pilots would, in flight, turn one of, or in some cases both, fuel control switches to cutoff. Let me explain the first situation. If you were to lose a single engine and the Boeing 787 flies just fine on one engine, even with the gear down, or if the flaps were retracted prematurely. In fact, the Air India pilots went into the simulator and tried all of those scenarios. We did a video, I think, about 10 days ago, where we talked here on this channel about several of the theories of how this airplane could have lost both engines. The Air India pilots went into the simulator after that and tested all of those scenarios. And with a total electrical failure, a total hydraulic failure, they could not induce a dual engine failure from those two things. Even with the flaps brought up prematurely and the gear down on one engine, the airplane still flew out. But if one engine had failed right at rotate, is it conceivable that one of the pilots mistakenly grabbed the other fuel control lever and put it to cutoff? Well, it's not very probable, and here's why. Our training, everybody's training follows this pattern. If you have an engine failure on rotate, which we test all of the time, right? When we're in training in the simulator, we practice this all the time. You don't touch anything until a minimum of 400 feet, and you normally don't touch anything until about 1,000 feet. There's something called an engine out altitude, and that's set for every takeoff for just that scenario where you'd lose a single engine. The pilot flying will say my aircraft. The other pilot will then begin to bring up the checklist. The pilot flying will say quick reference checklist. They'll pull out a laminated checklist. They'll then begin to coordinate their efforts back and forth to get through the first 3 or 4 steps on that checklist after they get above 400 feet and the airplane is climbing safely and the landing gear has been brought up. At that point, the pilot flying will say, let's start the checklist. The pilot monitoring will do the first item, which would be auto throttle, and they'll point to the auto throttle the switch, and they'll say left side or right side, depending on which engine has failed. And then they both concur with that, and they turn it off. Next is the thrust levers. And then the one pilot flying will touch the thrust levers. The other one will say left thrust lever to idle. He'll say idle, and he'll pull it all back. And then it's challenge, response, response. The one will challenge, the other will respond, and the other pilot will respond. There's double confirmation of every procedure that gets done. The final one, and the most important one, is the fuel control lever from run to cutoff. The pilot flying will touch it. The pilot monitoring will confirm it. The pilot flying will then take it from run to cutoff, and that cuts off fuel to the engine. That doesn't get done for 30 to 60 seconds at a minimum when you're doing the procedure properly. Is it possible that one of the engines flamed out and one of the pilots just panicked or inadvertently reached down and grabbed the wrong fuel lever and shut it off? It's anything's a possibility, but that's not part of their training, and it's not something that they would do. And it doesn't explain the Wall Street Journal report that both fuel control levers were placed to the cutoff position. Now, is there ever a situation, standard operating procedure, where both fuel control switches would be placed to cutoff in flight? There is one and one only, and that's called a dual engine failure. That's also on that quick reference checklist. The dual engine failure requires the pilot monitoring to take both fuel control levers and place them to cutoff and then back to run. That's the entire procedure. They don't sit and cut off for a while. It's not like you count to 1, 2, 3 and then put them back. You go right to cut off, right back to run. Now, that procedure obviously was not done. There is never, ever in the history of commercial flight ever been a procedure where you take both fuel cutoff switches and put them to cutoff and leave them there, especially not seconds after rotate. Now, one of the things that's bothered me in this whole scenario from the beginning was how quickly the Ram air turbine, or the RAT, deployed. Shortly after takeoff, and I'm talking 4 or 5 seconds after takeoff, that RAT comes out. The RAT is there as a last resort in case there is a dual engine failure. And a dual engine failure normally takes some time to progress. Those big old engines need to spool down. It might take 30 to 60 seconds for them to completely fail to send the message to the RAT to deploy. It's designed to be something that happens at altitude, maybe 35,000 feet. Both engines flame out. They spool down. The RAT then deploys to give you electric, hydraulic. It doesn't give you any thrust, but it gives you enough to fly the airplane and shoot an approach when you get down and talk on a radio. Now, that RAT came out almost immediately. Why would that RAT come out so quickly? Because the whole flight didn't last more than 60 seconds. The only explanation is that both of those fuel control levers were placed to cutoff. That would immediately deploy the RAT. The RAT now, the airplane is in what's called airborne logic as opposed to ground logic. What's the difference between those two? When the airplane is on the ground and there's weight on the wheels, there's a thing called a weight on wheels switch that tells the airplane it's on the ground. So, for instance, when I get to the gate and I instruct my co-pilot to turn both fuel control switches to cutoff, I don't want the RAT to deploy. And it's not going to do that on the ground because the airplane knows that it's on the ground and the rat will never be needed on the ground. Once I'm airborne and the weight comes off of those wheels, the airplane now reverts to the airborne logic in the computer, and it knows that I'm flying. If both fuel control switches were to place to cutoff, maybe I'm doing the dual engine procedure and then going back to run, as soon as I go to cutoff, boom, that rat's going to deploy immediately because the airplane knows I need it. So at that point, when they were placed to cutoff, the rat came out. That explains why and how the rat came out so quickly after takeoff in a short flight that didn't last even a minute. So that's the what of what happened. There was a dual engine loss. It was due to the fuel control switches being placed to cutoff. Now, the next question is going to be, could that have been a mistake? Could that have been done inadvertently? No, the answer is absolutely not. The switches, even though they're called switches, they're not like a light switch. It's not just a simple flip on and flip off switch. All of us have leaned against a light switch at some point and the lights went out and we looked around and we went, oh, sorry, and we put the switch back on. That's not how these work. This is a switch that requires manipulation. You have to grab it with both fingers. It has a detent that holds it into the run position. So let's say we're going from cutoff to run. It's a spring-loaded switch, so we have to grab it, grasp it, pull it out, pull it up, and release it over the detents. That's how it goes to the run position, and then it stays there for the duration of the flight, unless, of course, there's an engine failure and you need to bring it back to the cutoff position. But taking it from run to cutoff is also that same three-step procedure. You have to grasp it, pull it up over the detent, pull it down and release it because it's spring-loaded to the cutoff position. At that point, when it's in the cutoff position, it will command the fuel valves at the engines to close. That'll cut off fuel to the engines, and the engines will then flame out at that point. The only way that that can be done is by a human being grabbing those fuel control switches and placing them in that position. There is no procedure, and there never has been any procedure or any mistake that's possible that those fuel control switches would be placed from run to cutoff just after rotate on an aircraft. There just isn't. So that's the what of it all, and that's basically kind of the how of it all. According to these very reputable sources, that's exactly what happened. So now, with that being said, it takes us to another area that's very difficult for us to deal with, and that's the area of why would something like this take place? And we may never have an answer to that. To be quite honest with you, never have an answer to that. But we do need to delve into that because I think it's hugely important and it's a big question that's sitting out there that at least we need to try to attempt to answer. And that's where my other area of expertise comes in. I'm not just Captain Steve, who flies an airliner for a major airline, and I'm also Dr. Steve. And I've been a doctor now for, I think I had my doctorate about 15 years ago, but I've been a trained, experienced counselor for well over 30 years. And I've counseled thousands of people, families, individuals, couples, you name it. And quite honestly, I probably do more counseling at 37,000 feet in an airplane than I actually do on the ground, because pilots want to talk, and this is a very stressful job. And everybody, I think, understands that. There's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of trust that's placed in pilots. It's an extremely stressful job. And how do you balance home life with your work life, especially when you're traveling as much as you do, and the fatigue that's involved in the being away and all of those things? It's a pressure cooker on a lot of pilots. I got interested in counseling about 35 years ago, and it was because of something that happened in the cockpit on a flight. Let me explain. I was an instructor in the Navy at the time on active duty, and I was training students to earn their wings, and that's the most stressful, most extensive training any pilot gets on the planet, and it's designed to be stressful on purpose. If you're going to become a naval aviator, you're going to earn those coveted wings of gold, and we're going to make sure. I know that because I had gone through that program 8 years earlier as a student, and I earned my wings. Then 8 years later, now I'm an instructor, and I'm the guy that's instructing, or I'm delivering the stress to the students. I had two students that I've been flying with for about 7 days in a row. Excellent students, very good sticks, very good pilots. And I was on the last flight with them before I handed them off to their next phase of training. It was a very early morning brief. It was about 6 a.m. in the morning. We're sitting around the table talking, getting ready for their next evaluation. And the one student who had been excellent, he just was distracted. He wasn't there. It was hard to put your finger on. There was something wrong. We got out to the airplane. We took off. He was the first student in the seat. We get up to altitude. We're out in the operating area. We're going through some of the procedures, and he just is awful. I was like, wow, what am I going to do with this guy? And at that moment, I just asked him a simple question. And I said, is everything okay? And when I said that, he just started to cry. I took the airplane from him. I said, look, my aircraft, I said, what's going on, man? And he explained to me that he had been up until about 3 o'clock in the morning on the phone with his father, who lived in the Midwest, and his father was attempting to commit suicide. His dad had a loaded gun in his lap, and this student, his son, had been talking his dad down off the cliff. Basically, he'd been talking him out of committing suicide. He did so. His dad didn't kill himself, but now 3 hours later, he's in a brief trying to go fly an airplane. I said, oh my word, let's just call him Dave. Dave, you shouldn't be in an airplane right now. I said, Dave, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to handle today. I said, we're going to go back. We're going to land. You and I are going to walk up to the ops boss. I'm going to explain to him that you need at least a week off. If you need more time, we'll get you that. You need to go take care of your family life and your dad and your own emotional well-being. I said, we're going to pretend like today never happened. And that's exactly what we did. We went back, we talked to the ops boss. Everybody was understanding. They said, hey, Dave, go take care of business. Dave did take the week off. He came back. He got his dad the help he needed. Dad never committed suicide. Dad got on the right track after that. Dave had a much better frame of mind, and he continued on to his training, earned his wings of gold, and everything was wonderful. But from that moment, I realized that I needed to add something to my pre-flight brief, and that was the question, how you doing? And not just a surfacey how you doing, but a more important in-depth how you doing? And so what I did was I got an interest in becoming a counselor, but I'm going to encourage my pilots that watch this channel, and a lot of passengers watch this, and a lot of people that are just interested in aviation, but I want to talk to my pilots right now. Guys and gals, I want to ask you to do this. I want you to work into your pre-flight routine every time you go flying. Whether you're a first officer or you're a captain, doesn't make any difference. Ask your fellow pilots this question: how you doing? And I mean, make it a serious question. And if they give you the surfacey, fine, right? Dig a little deeper. Say, no, I'm serious. How are you today? Everything going all right at home? Now, 99 times out of 100, you're going to get the answer, yeah, everything's fine. They might follow up and say, how are you doing? You go, hey, I'm doing great too. I'm glad to hear it. Are you ready to go flying? Yeah, I'm ready to go flying. But every once in a while, you're going to hear somebody that says, are you serious about that? Yeah, I am. Well, I'm glad you asked, because nobody else has, and I don't know who to talk to, but things aren't so well at home, or I'm under a lot of stress. And you're going to open up a conversation that maybe you can resolve it right there. Maybe it needs further counseling, but you can make the call at that point and say, hey, I don't think we're ready to go flying today. I'm not sure what happened in this situation. All I know is that some human being in that cockpit took those two fuel control levers from run, and they placed them to cut off. That airplane, that Boeing aircraft, and those GE engines were operating exactly according to their design. There was nothing wrong with the airplane, either the engines or the design from Boeing. What happened was somebody placed those switches to cut off. We don't know the reason why. We may never know the reason why. But I think we need to invest in one another, and we need to get to that point where we really dig in and we go on a deeper level to make sure that both of our pilots are ready to go flying. So folks, as hard as it is for us to accept what happened to Air India 171, we must accept it on some level. It's difficult. We don't want to wrap our brain around it. We don't want to wrap our heart around it. But at the end of the day, we must, because we have to face these issues. Now, going forward, we're going to open up a conversation on this channel about mental health and emotional health. And we've got lined up an expert in this area. He towers over me in terms of what he knows about this. He has been instrumental in starting programs at most major airlines that you would recognize their names. He is absolutely brilliant in this area. We're just working out the details of getting that interview put together. We're going to bring that to you a few days from now, as soon as we can arrange it. But you're going to love hearing from this guy. He is absolutely the best. And it's going to reassure you that it's safe to go flying because of what is being done today, hands-on, with helping pilots deal with their emotional and their mental well-being. But for us to wrap our brains around it and to accept it is very, very difficult. I know how challenging this is for you. It's very challenging for me as well. But I think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said it best when he said this: when you've eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Now you know. I'm Captain Steve. Fly safe.